All right, now I've had more than my fair share of arguments, disagreements, whatever you want to call it, with Oklahoma fans over the last couple of years, and I'm sure that's going to continue after today's video. This is a preview and a game-by-game prediction for the 2024 Oklahoma Sooners college football team. I'm going to put the schedule up on the screen here in a few minutes and go through it game by game and give you a prediction for every single game on their schedule, a win and a loss, and we'll come up with an overall record for Oklahoma in 2024, which of course will be their first season in the SEC. Them in Texas making the move this offseason to the SEC. They'll both be playing full SEC schedules. I'll get to more on my disagreements with Oklahoma fans as we go through this video, but let's wrap up last year for Oklahoma here. Well, actually, before we do that, shout out to Greg G and Not Host over on the Uncle Lou Patreon page. They requested a Oklahoma preview and game-by-game prediction. So Not Host, Greg G, I hope y'all enjoy this video, and I really appreciate y'all helping to support the show and the channel over on the Uncle Lou Patreon page. I say it a lot, but probably not enough. Without the support I get from people like y'all over on the Patreon page, I would not be able to do this full-time year-round. So big shout-out to y'all, and I really hope you enjoy the video. If you're on the Patreon page, make sure you go over there. You'll see the post. It's the first post on the page over there about these prediction videos. Make sure you leave a comment. Let me know what team it is you want to see me do a preview and prediction for, because every day when I sit down and get ready to do these videos, that's where I go, the Patreon page. I scroll through the list and I just pick a team out. And today, Oklahoma drew the short straw, I guess. So that's what we're doing today. Let's wrap up last year. Then we'll move into this year, who they lost, who's coming back, coaching situations, any questions or concerns we might have on either side of the ball. And then we'll put the schedule up and go through it. But of course, 10-2 in the regular season last year, 10-3 after their bowl game, 7-2 in the Big 12. Those two losses, of course, coming to Kansas and Oklahoma State by a combined total of 8 points. They lost to Kansas by 5 and lost to Oak State by 3. They did have the big win over Texas, which was probably their best game of the season. We'll talk more about that one in a minute when we get to their quarterback situation. 20 or more points given up by Oklahoma 9 times last year, 9 times in a row. Their last 9 games, their last 8 regular season games, and their bowl game, they gave up 20 points or more. This is sort of the crux of the disagreement I've been having with Oklahoma fans. Again, we'll get into that more in a second, but they got to clean up the defensive side of the ball. It just basically goes without saying. And moving from the Big 12 to the SEC, Oklahoma, believe it or not, has not made the Big 12 title game in 3 years. The last time Oklahoma made the Big 12 title game was the COVID season of 2020. They missed out in 21, 22, and 23. So after a long stretch of playoff appearances, Big 12 championships, and Big 12 championship game appearances under Lincoln Riley, it's been a while since they've been there. Not able to get to the Big 12 championship game now in 3 straight years. And now moving into the SEC, and you can just answer the question for yourself. Do you think the SEC schedule that Oklahoma is going to have in any given year is going to be harder or easier than the Big 12 schedule they had in any random year? Again, I think the answer to that question is obvious, but feel free to come up with your own answer there. Something else that's a little surprising to me, because if I'm not mistaken, I think Oklahoma leads the country in number of All-Americans all time. I could be wrong about that, but I think I've heard that stat before. They haven't had an All-American since 2019, so it's been a while. Not that they don't have any good players, and you can make the argument that being an All-American, I don't think being an All-American is overrated, but I think there are a lot of players in a given year who are good enough to be All-Americans, but don't make All-American status because there's some great other player that plays that position. I happen to be a Georgia fan. Georgia's my favorite college football team, and Nick Chubb is a pretty good example of this. I mean, most people would consider Nick Chubb to be maybe the second greatest running back in Georgia history, behind only Herschel Walker. And you're talking about a team in Georgia that's had a ton of great running backs. Nick Chubb was never an All-American. So that's not to say that Oklahoma hasn't had any good players. It's just they've had a ton of All-Americans throughout history, and I don't know the last time they went 4 years without having any, but they haven't had one since 2019. What do they need to work on specifically as a result from moving a Big 12 to SEC? And I hate to use Texas as a comparison and a contrast here in an Oklahoma video, because believe me, as someone who has grown up watching SEC football for my entire life, basically, I understand what it is to what it is to have a bitter rival and the feelings that go along with that. Trust me. I don't think Oklahoma has prepared nearly as well for the transition to the SEC as Texas has. Now, you might say, well, that's obvious. Look at their records over the last couple of years or whatever. On the other hand, you might say, well, what are you talking about? Oklahoma beat Texas. Texas, it seems to me, first of all, they've had Sarkisian for a longer period of time than Oklahoma has had Venables. So they've sort of been on whatever roadmap each team has. Texas is sort of further down that road than Oklahoma is, just by nature of the fact that Sarkisian has been at Texas longer than Venables has been at Oklahoma. But you look at Texas and the way they've sort of developed their offensive and defensive lines, the skill position players they've gotten. Texas has begun to look like an SEC team, really going back a couple of years, but especially last year. Oklahoma, I know, is trying to get there, and I truly believe that's one of the reasons they brought Brent Venables in, or I think Brent Venables is well suited for that. I know he was an ACC coach, but you look at what he did at Clemson as defensive coordinator, an NFL defensive line. So I think Oklahoma understands what they need to do in order to succeed in the SEC. I just think Texas happens to be a step or two further down that road than Oklahoma is. I have serious questions when I look at Oklahoma about, number one, their offensive line, which is completely rebuilt for this year. And number two, their defense. And if I had to pinpoint something specific on that defensive side of the ball, it would be primarily the secondary. And this gets into the issue. I don't even know if issue is the right word. And it's really not even an argument. It's been more of a disagreement between me and Oklahoma fans. When I watch Oklahoma over the last couple of years, I see a really good offense and a defense that's a mile away from mattering. That's what I see as a neutral third-party observer. I don't hate Oklahoma. I don't love Oklahoma. I'm really indifferent to Oklahoma. Georgia did play Oklahoma in the 2017 Rose Bowl, one of the best college football playoff games and one of the best Rose Bowls of all time. Georgia ended up winning that game in overtime, but like there's no reason for me to have any hate or ill will or, this guy's just a hater or whatever. I'm just giving you my honest thoughts and opinions when I watch Oklahoma over the last couple of years. Now, under Lincoln Riley, everyone agrees what was going on there. It was, an offensive juggernaut, one of the best offenses in the country year in and year out, Heisman caliber QBs year in and year out, and a defense that couldn't stop a nosebleed. They bring in Brent Venables with the idea being, well, we got to fix that, right? When I watch Oklahoma the last couple of years, I don't see much of a difference between what I saw under Lincoln Riley and what I'm seeing now under Brent Venables. The only differences I see are in the end result, in that Lincoln Riley was better than Brent Venables, or at least Lincoln Riley's Oklahoma teams were better than Brent Venables' Oklahoma teams. I mean, say what we want about Lincoln Riley, and Lord knows I've had a ton to say. The guy won the Big 12 almost every year. He was in the playoffs. He was in Big 12 title games. Been 3 years since they've been there now. So when I watch Oklahoma, I see missed tackles. I see, not knowing the assignment, out of position, poor fundamentals, and honestly, just not the caliber of player or athlete that you need on that side of the ball to compete at the highest level. I understand they went 10-2. That was a good season. But again, gave up 20 points or more in 9 straight games to end the season. In the Big 12, you can get away with that. Not so much in the SEC, I don't think. I really think unless Oklahoma's defense takes a giant step forward in 2024, they are going to be in for a really rough first year in the SEC. The disagreement comes when I mention that in videos. I get flooded with Oklahoma fans who tell me, no, the defense is great. The offense is the problem. I don't get that. I don't understand that. Dylan Gabriel was one of the best quarterbacks in the country last year. He was in the top 3 or 4 of everyone's Heisman list halfway through the season, particularly after that Texas game. He single-handedly won that Texas game for Oklahoma, basically. He bolts. You now have Jackson Arnold. We'll talk more about him in a second. A lot of potential, 5-star. Everybody wanted him, that kind of thing. We saw him play in the bowl game, and, well, I think you remember what we saw there. But the Oklahoma fans seem to be under the impression that all of their problems were on the offensive side of the ball last year. And when two things, when I watch Oklahoma play, I don't see that. And when you go back and look at, if you just want to look at stats, even if you didn't watch Oklahoma play, you just want to look at stats, like their offensive stats are in the top 5, a lot of places, top 10, top 15, top 20. Then you look at their defensive stats, they're hovering closer to 100 than they are to first. It's just, it seems obvious to me that the problems were defensive in nature, but that's just a disagreement, I guess, that me and Oklahoma fans are going to have to the end of time, maybe that argument will be settled this season because Oklahoma fans got their wish. The offensive coordinator is gone. They blamed him for all their problems, which was, again, mind-boggling to me. He's gone. They bring a new offensive coordinator in. Dylan Gabriel, a Heisman caliber QB last year, is gone. Jackson Arnold, the 5-star second-year savior, is going to get the start. So I guess we'll see, right? We'll see this season. It's not all bad for Oklahoma. I mean, Jackson Arnold does have a ton of potential. Their front seven on defense, I think, could be pretty good this year if they can take a step forward, and they've got maybe one of the best wide receiver groups in the SEC. So they've got some talent. They recruit really well, really well. If you look at their last 3 or 4 recruiting classes, they're all top 10. They have 2 8th ranked recruiting classes in the last 3 years and a 5th rated recruiting class in the last 3 years. So Britt Venables has done a good job there on the recruiting trail, 3 straight top 10 classes. They've even done well in the portal, 20th, 8th, and 4th, I believe. So 3 top 20, 2 top 10 portal classes over the last 3 years. When you look at 24/7's talent index, which, again, you can take that for what it's worth or what you think it's worth. Last year, they had the 9th most talented team in the country. And again, you sort of see that in the end record. 10-2 is a good season. I know Oklahoma wants to do better, but 10-2, 9th best or 9th most talented team in the country according to 24/7. That seems to add up to me. What does Vegas think about Oklahoma's chances this season, their first year in the SEC? Well, when you look at their win total, Vegas has set their win total at 7.5. And when you see Oklahoma in a win total of 7.5, you have to look twice. It's been a long time since we've seen Oklahoma with a win total this low. And I think the reason for this is kind of obvious. It's the move to the SEC. And honestly, it's the questions about Oklahoma that I've already kind of highlighted. Some defensive issues, a brand new quarterback, a brand new offensive coordinator. Not to say that those things are going to be bad, but some of those things right now are unknown. And Vegas doesn't like the unknown. They've got Oklahoma win total at 7.5. What are their chances to win a national title, according to the people out in Vegas? Well, they've got the 18th best odds to win the national title at plus 6,000. That puts them in the same category as teams like Utah and Southern Cal. What about winning the SEC? Is there any way Oklahoma could do that in their first year in the SEC? I don't think so. Vegas says they're the 9th best team in the SEC. They list their odds at plus 4,000 to win the SEC. That puts them just below Texas A&M. So if you think Texas A&M has a shot, maybe you think Oklahoma has a shot. But Oklahoma just below Texas A&M. Texas A&M has the 8th best odds to win the SEC. Oklahoma the 9th. Can they make the playoffs? You know, we're expanding to a 12-team playoff this year, so it's becoming. I don't want to say it's becoming easier to make the playoffs, even though it is. I mean, if you go from 4 to 12, that obviously means it's easier to make the playoffs. Really, it just means, more teams are going to have an opportunity to get into the playoffs. Can Oklahoma be one of those 12 teams? Because even if they don't win the SEC, there's still, 7 at-large bids to get into the playoffs. Could Oklahoma get one of those at-large bids even if they don't win the SEC? Well, according to the people out in the desert, there's a better chance that Oklahoma doesn't make the playoffs than that they do. Their odds to make the playoffs are at plus 450. That gives them the same odds as a team like NC State. So again, whatever you might think about NC State's chances of making the playoffs, according to the people in Vegas, Oklahoma's got about that same amount of chance to get in. Again, that doesn't mean that's how this season will go. These are betting numbers. These are just the numbers that are out there. I don't think they're the end-all, be-all. No single bit of information or data point or anything like that you look at is sort of the end-all, be-all. You kind of have to take all of this information, throw it into a pot, mix it around, and do your best to come up with what you think a team might be in a given year. Let's take a look at the offense. I mentioned Dylan Gabriel. He's gone. Jackson Arnold's going to get the start. This will be a second start, right? Or did he actually? I know Dylan Gabriel got hurt something. Anyway, he started the bowl game. It was not good, Jackson Arnold. Now, he had a ton of yards. I think he had 350-something total yards, but he had 4 turnovers. And this is the problem with a first-year starting quarterback that keeps coaches up at night, right? Bad decisions and turnovers. And no matter how much potential or even how good a quarterback is, a first-year starter tends to make a lot of boneheaded decisions, and we saw that in that bowl game from Jackson Arnold. Obviously, he's going to have to clean that up heading into 2024. Now, with that bowl game, he had basically 2 weeks to practice as the starting quarterback, getting first-team reps in practice, working with the wide receiver ones, right? Not a lot of time. Now he's got an entire spring, an entire offseason, an entire summer and fall camp leading into the season where he's getting those first team reps. he's getting that work with the wide receivers, right? I expect him to take a significant step forward this season versus what we saw in the bowl game. How many steps forward? That remains to be seen, right? We'll take a look at the schedule for a minute. I like when I have a first-year unknown starting quarterback, I like to kind of start out with a couple of easier games given the choice, kind of let my new quarterback get his feet wet. We'll see if that's the case for Oklahoma. Jackson Arnold's got a ton of potential. Like I mentioned, he was a 5-star. Everybody wanted him. We'll see what he can do this year at Oklahoma. He takes over for Dylan Gabriel. New offensive coordinator, Seth Luttrell. So here, Oklahoma fans are getting what they wanted. Every Oklahoma fan I talked to last year blamed the offensive coordinator and the play calling for 100% of their problems. They refused to acknowledge any defensive problems at all, which, again, I think is weird. I happen to think the reason they're having a hard time accepting their defensive problems is because Brent Venables is a defensive coach, and he was brought in specifically to fix the defensive side of the ball, which had just completely gone to shit under Lincoln Riley. And they're having a hard time accepting the fact that, at least so far, that hasn't been the case. Again, I'm not saying that means Oklahoma's defense will be bad this year. I'm not putting Brent Venables in the same category as Lincoln Riley, where, guy's been around 10 years, terrible defense every year. We know Brent Venables is a great defensive coach. We saw him do it for over a decade at Clemson. It's just so far that hasn't translated to Oklahoma, at least not to me. Anyway, we'll move on from that. Only 4 players. This is another concerning stat here. Now, again, because of the transfer portal, some of this can be mitigated. But Oklahoma only returns 4 players on offense who started 6 games or more last year. So when you look at things like returning production, offensively, Oklahoma is going to be way down the list because, of course, they lost their quarterback. And you see here, they only have 4 players returning who started 6 games or more. So there are going to be a lot of new faces on the offensive side of the ball. Talked about Jackson Arnold. The offensive line, we'll talk about that in a second, completely rebuilt. Now, one place where they're not going to have any questions about who's going to be out there is going to be at the wide receiver position. When you look at Farouk, Anthony, the 3 wide receivers, Farouk, Anthony, and Anderson, they all played a ton last year. They're all back this year. And Oklahoma went out to the portal and hit what could be a potential home run with Purdue transfer Deion Burks. I mentioned earlier in the video that I think Oklahoma might end up having one of, if not the best wide receiver groups in the SEC. And these 4 guys are 4 big reasons why. These are 4 really good wide receivers. Running back, they need to find an RB2, somebody to supplement Sawchuk, Gavin Sawchuk. And he wasn't, I wouldn't call him great last year, but he ended the season great. He had 5 straight 100-yard games to close out the season. So he sort of picked up as the season went along, and he's back. The biggest question and what could be the biggest liability, and if Vegas's prediction of 7 or 8 wins for Oklahoma comes true, it's going to be because of this offensive line. The offensive line has not been great the last couple of years, and there's a ton of new faces there this year, a ton of turnover, moving pieces around, bringing new pieces in. It's a completely rebuilt offensive line. And I think that is going to determine how good or not good Oklahoma's offense ends up being over the course of the season, as much as the play of Jackson Arnold. Those 2 things. Can Jackson Arnold play at the 5-star level he was recruited at in year 1 as a starter? And can that offensive line protect him and open up holes for Gavin Sawchuk? Those 2 questions, the quarterback and the offensive line, are going to tell us a lot about how far Oklahoma can go this year. You look over on the defensive side of the ball, bad the first 2 years under Brent Venables. Again, just my opinion. It doesn't even make it true. It's just my opinion. So if the Oklahoma fans can continue to get mad, continue to tell me I'm wrong, that Oklahoma's, there's no problems on Oklahoma's defense, even though I'm giving you the info here. 20 or more points allowed in the last 9 games of the season. Ranked 50th and below in almost every single major defensive category, while they're in the top 10 offensively and everything. And the Oklahoma fans are looking me dead in the eye for 2 years straight and telling me the offense sucks and the defense is great. I don't get it. It's like, that show Stranger Things where they have the upside down world. That's what it's like talking to Oklahoma fans. In my opinion, the last 2 years, they refuse to acknowledge any defensive problems, but we'll see. Wasn't good the first 2 years, in my opinion. Now, that's the bad news. Good news is they return 11 of their top 13 tacklers from last year. Now, those 11 players are going to have to play better. They're going to have to be in position more often and out of position less often than what they were last year. They're going to have to bring players to the ground when they make contact, stop with the arm tackles. It's really looked like a Lincoln Riley defense in a lot of ways the last 2 years. They got to clean that up. 2 all Big 12 players return for Oklahoma. These could be probably will be two of the best players on the team for Oklahoma. You got a linebacker, Strutman, is that his name? And then a safety, Bowman Jr. They'll both be really, really good. And I think I mentioned before, I like Oklahoma's front seven. I do have some questions about the secondary. Now, the safety is good, and they got, one corner spot, I think, locked up. They got to figure out the other corner spot, and they just got to play better overall as a unit in the secondary. But I like the front seven, and they brought the guy in from TCU out of the transfer portal. What did I write his name down? Dominic Williams. He's a big body that can clog up space in the middle of that defensive line. I think he'll be an immediate starter there at Oklahoma and could make a difference along that defensive line. Let's put the schedule up on the screen. Enough talking about it. It's time to actually go through it and give you a winner and a loser for every single week. Now, when I look at this schedule, here's the things that pop out to me. Look at all these SEC teams. That's number one, right? You got a lot of this going on in college football right now, teams changing conferences, and Big Ten and SEC in particular, but even the ACC added some meaningless teams too. But I guess that doesn't matter. But so totally revamped, redone, a schedule that Oklahoma fans have never seen. I don't care if you're a 100-year-old Oklahoma fan, you've never seen a schedule like this. You're in the SEC. Here we go. What jumps out? Well, a bunch of home games to start the season is what jumps out to me right away. In fact, 4 straight home games to start the season. Great news for a team breaking in a new quarterback, Jackson Arnold. I think that's great. You look at the first 3 games, and they're all extremely winnable. These are non-con games. Houston is a Power 5 opponent, but they're new to the Power 5, and they're just not very good. Then you get Temple and Tulane. Temple is a nobody. Tulane has been good the last couple of years, but they lost their coaches and their quarterback. Expected to take a step back this year. So it looks like sort of a 3-game preseason for Oklahoma, which, again, to me, is great when you're breaking in a new quarterback. So I think the beginning of this schedule sets up great for a team like Oklahoma. I'll look at the road games at Auburn. Auburn is not a great team. They're not a top 5, 6, 7 team in the SEC, but that is a top 5 or 6 environment to have to go and play in. That will be a crazy, wild environment for Oklahoma on the road at Auburn. Texas game stays in its usual spot, played in the usual place at the State Fair there. Oklahoma gets a bye week before that. A trip to Ole Miss. Ole Miss, not a very difficult place to play in terms of atmospheres and environments, at least not compared to the top 4 or 5 road environments in the SEC. But unlike Auburn, Ole Miss does have a really, really good team and could be a top 10 team and could be competing for an SEC championship and a playoff berth. So not an easy game there. You look at the back end of the schedule here, a couple of road games at Missouri and at LSU, back-to-back games with Bama and LSU, 3 games in a row with Missouri, Bama, and LSU, although you do have a bye week there. So, again, a tougher back end of the schedule than front end of the schedule, which, breaking in a new quarterback, if you had to choose sort of, do you want your schedule front-loaded or back-loaded, I think you'd take back-loaded. And that's what you have. I see 3 games on here I don't have to think about at all. They're sort of automatic wins. Temple to start things out. Houston in week 2. Both of those are non-con games. And Maine, a non-con game you get late in the year. I think those are just, no matter what happens, I don't see any way possible. Injuries, commit 6 turnovers, whatever. I don't see any way possible you lose any of those 3 games. Those are as close to automatic wins as you can get in the world of college football. Let's go through the rest of the schedule. Tulane, I think you beat Tulane. I know they've had a good team the last couple of years. They beat Southern Cal in a New Year's 6 game a couple of years ago, but like I mentioned, the coaches and that quarterback are gone, expected to take a step back. And honestly, even if they don't take a step back, they shouldn't be competing with a team like Oklahoma. Oklahoma should start the season 3-0. And by this point in the season, we'll all have seen Jackson Arnold play 3 games. And even though the competition might not be what he'll see later in the year, this is extremely valuable experience for a first-year starting quarterback to have here. We'll know a lot more about Jackson Arnold, the offensive line, and Oklahoma's offense after these first 3 games of the season, obviously, than we know right now. And then things get difficult because Tennessee comes to town. Now, Tennessee has struggled mostly the last 25 years or so. Not going to go through all that. Oklahoma actually played a series with Tennessee about 10 years ago now a home and home. They get them this year at home. Their first ever SEC game at home in Norman. Tennessee comes to town. They're going to have one of the best offenses in the SEC. Like Oklahoma, they are playing a first-year starting quarterback that was very highly rated that everybody wanted. This will be the Jackson Arnold versus Nico, I'm about to leave you game here. The only advantage I see for Oklahoma, honestly, is that the game's played in Norman. I think Tennessee's the better team. It's interesting, the Josh Heupel angle here. He was sort of ran out of town on a rail there from Oklahoma when things started to go bad. What was that, 15 years ago, whatever it was, when he was an assistant there. He's sort of going back home here to Norman. He wants to get this win bad. And I think this is a huge game for Tennessee. It's a big game for Oklahoma in that it's their first SEC game. It's at home. Like, the crowd will be nuts, I'm sure. But this is a huge game for Tennessee. Tennessee's got legitimate thoughts that they could possibly punch a ticket to the playoffs this year. And when you look at their schedule later on, again, this isn't a Tennessee video. But this is a huge game for Tennessee for this reason. They've got huge games later in the season against teams like Georgia, Bama, a couple of others. And it seems like to me, if Tennessee can't beat Oklahoma, they most likely have no chance of beating those other teams later in the year that they would need to beat in order to get into the playoffs. That's just my opinion on Tennessee. If Tennessee does beat Oklahoma here on the road in Norman, they play NC State earlier in the year, so they'll be a little bit more battle-tested. Not that NC State's a top 5 team, but they're ranked in the top 20. They're a better team than anybody Oklahoma will have played. So they'll sort of be more battle-tested at this point than Oklahoma will. And if Tennessee goes into Norman and wins there after having beat NC State, and they're sitting there at 4-0 with 2 ranked wins in the first month of the season, I think there becomes a very good chance that Tennessee ends up in the playoffs at the end of the year. Even if they lose to Bama and Georgia, which I think is likely, they would be sitting at 10-2 with 2 pretty good wins early in the year with the NC State and the Oklahoma. I think this is a huge game for Tennessee's season down the road, and I think Tennessee gets the win. I think they come into Oklahoma. Unfortunately for Oklahoma, I think their first SEC game is a home loss to a Tennessee team that does have a legitimate chance at making the playoffs this year. You turn around, you go on the road to Auburn. Very difficult environment to play in. I've got you beating Auburn, and I'm going to be honest, I went back and forth on these two. Here's the thing. I look at Oklahoma's schedule, and I say, can they start 5-0? I don't think they can. That was the first kind of conclusion I came to. I don't think they can start 5-0. It feels like a 3-2 or 4-1 start. Okay, well, if they're not going to start 5-0, where's the loss? And, of course, it came down to, well, Tennessee or Auburn, because I don't think you're losing to Temple, Houston, or Tulane, right? I also don't think, unless Jackson Arnold is a sort of complete flop, which I would be surprised, I also don't think you're losing to both Tennessee and Auburn. Now, on one hand, it would make more sense to say, well, you'll beat Tennessee because it's at home, but then you'll turn around and lose to Auburn because it's on the road. First of all, Tennessee's just a much better team than Auburn. I like Hugh Freeze in terms of his potential as a coach there, but he still doesn't have a quarterback there that can do what he wants him to do. Peyton Thorne, and I'm not high on him at all. I think the chances are Nico's going to be a much better quarterback than Peyton Thorne is. So really what it came down to me was the fact that game is so big for Tennessee in Norman. I think they find a way to get it done. And so because of that, I gave you the win against Auburn because I think you're starting 4-1. So anyway, it's a long-winded explanation to tell you that I think you're starting 4-1 with a loss to Tennessee and a win on the road at Auburn. And you get your first bye week, come out of that, Red River Shootout. One of the best games of the year last year, one of the best Red River Shootouts we've seen in a long time. I'm going with Texas. This is really going to burn the Oklahoma fans up, I know, because I said this last year, but I picked Texas in the game last year, and Texas lost. Oklahoma beat them. I came out the next day and I said, congratulations to Oklahoma. Great game. They deserved the win. Can't take anything away from them. And if they played again tomorrow, I'd pick Texas again. That's how I felt. I think Texas is just a better team. They're veteran, returning quarterback. They returned all their coaches and coordinators. Now they got to get the secondary tightened up. Texas does. And if Jackson Arnold can avoid turnovers and these wide receivers pan out and they get some chemistry, then I do have some concerns for Texas there and their ability to slow down the Oklahoma offense if their secondary doesn't improve over there at Texas. But I've got to go with Texas in this one. I think that's your second loss. Then you get South Carolina at home. Again, this is a team I think that's really going to struggle this year. Shane Beamer started out well there. He exceeded expectations each of his first 2 years. It did not go well last year. Some of the fans are starting to sort of, I don't want to say lose faith in Shane Beamer, but some questions are starting to be asked there. And I just don't think they're going to have a very good year. You get them at home, I think you get a win against South Carolina. On the road at Ole Miss, and this same thing applies to Missouri a couple of weeks down the road. Ole Miss has a bye before they play Oklahoma. So does Missouri. Ole Miss is one of the best 10 teams in the country, period. They're going to be an interesting team. And you look at their schedule, it lines up well. Much like Tennessee, this is a game I feel like Ole Miss needs to win if they want to punch a ticket to the playoffs, or at least be in the conversation at the end of the year. You're on the road. You're playing them there. They have a bye week before to sort of help prepare. While you're coming off back-to-back games against Texas and South Carolina, I'm giving Ole Miss the win there. I think that's your third loss of the season. I think Lane Kiffin gets the win and beats Oklahoma. Then you have a non-con game against Maine. Clearly, that'll be an easy win. And then on the road at Missouri, same thing. When you look at Missouri's schedule, it's one of the easiest in the SEC. It might be the easiest in the SEC. They play Alabama, and they play Oklahoma, but they don't play Georgia. They don't play Texas. Some of their more difficult games are at home, like this one here. They get a bye week before this game. Late in the season, it feels like a must-win situation here for Mizzou if they want to keep their playoff hopes alive. And I think they do. I think they beat you. They lost that running back, Cody Schrader, but their coach is back. Their quarterback is back. Luther Burden's one of the best wide receivers in the country. I've got some questions about them defensively. They lost some talent over there. They lost some coaches over there, and they don't recruit in the top 10. Let's be honest. Oklahoma's a more talented team than Missouri is. I think this is just a situation where you got to play them there. It's late in the year. They got a veteran quarterback. You got a first-year starter. I think they find a way to get the win. Then you get your second bye week, and you come out of that, and welcome to the SEC here. You got Bama and LSU in back-to-back weeks. That's just they're not doing you any favors here. Everybody's beat up at the end of the year. It'll be no different here, and you got to play one of the most physical teams in the SEC in Bama, and potentially one of the best offenses on the road at LSU. Bama is hard to figure out. How many wins is Nick Saban worth a year? And I'm going to talk a lot more about this when I do the Alabama video, but we've listened to Alabama fans for 15 years tell us Nick Saban's the greatest coach in history. Almost everybody within the last 5 or 6 years has come to agree with that statement, that Nick Saban is probably the best coach in college football history. How many wins a year is the best coach in college football history worth? You can't spend a lot of time telling people that you have the best coach in the history of football. Then that coach leaves, and then try to tell everybody it's not going to make a difference when the new coach comes in. I think Kalen DeBoer's a good coach, but he's not as good as Saban. Like, Alabama fans would even have to admit that, right? It just feels to me like wherever Alabama's been at the last couple of years, they're going to be a little bit below that right now. That just feels that way to me. We'll see how Milroe ends up doing. I think Alabama's going to have one of the best run games in the country. Talked about Oklahoma's defense at the beginning of the year. My question marks about Oklahoma's defense are primarily on the back end. I think their front seven is going to be okay. It's going to have to be more than okay. It's going to have to be really good to great if they want to win this game at home against Bama. When I look at Oklahoma's SEC home games this year, a few stand out. The first one, right, because it's the first home SEC game, Tennessee. And it'll be a big game. 2 ranked teams. Both teams will probably be undefeated. It'll be a huge game, and I gave Tennessee the nod there. Your other SEC home games, South Carolina. Probably not all that excited about that one, right? What other home SEC games do you have? None. None. I mean, you get Texas, that's an SEC game, but you've been playing them forever, and that's a neutral site. You got Auburn on the road. You got Ole Miss on the road. You got Missouri on the road. You got LSU on the road. We'll talk about in a second. Can Oklahoma get one big home win? Yes, they can. And it's going to be against Alabama in the next to last week of the season. I think you beat Alabama at home. To sort of save the season. You can see by the record prediction I've got so far, I don't think Oklahoma's making the playoffs in 2024. I obviously could be wrong. A lot of this is going to come down to Jackson Arnold. If he's a superhero, Oklahoma could go 10-2 or 11-1 and get and make the playoffs. If Jackson Arnold's a superhero and the defense takes several steps forward, those two things absolutely have to happen. And Oklahoma could be 10-2, 11-1, win the SEC, make the playoffs, whatever. Obviously, I don't think that's going to happen based on the record I have. So, but do I think Oklahoma's good enough to win one big home game? Yeah. And there's only two options, Tennessee and Bama. I got you beating Bama at the end of the year. Then you go on the road to take on LSU. You'll still be celebrating your win over Bama, and LSU will beat you. I think LSU and Oklahoma are very similar teams this year. I really do. They both have new starting quarterbacks. Both offenses are expected to be pretty good, and there's a ton of questions about both defenses. I think this Oklahoma at LSU game has the potential to be one of the most entertaining games of the year in the SEC. I think this game could get into the 30s or even the 40s for both teams. If this game is at night, then you're going to really find out what LSU is about in terms of home atmospheres. And here's the thing, and I'll talk about this with Texas too. There is no atmosphere in the Big 12, no road atmosphere in the Big 12 that even comes close to the 4th, 5th, or 6th best road atmosphere in the SEC. There's not. You play, Texas and Oklahoma play each other every year, and that's a huge game, but the crowd is split 50-50, so it's not really a hostile environment, right? Now, if Texas had to go and play at Oklahoma every other year, yes, that would be one of the most hostile environments in all of college football, and Texas would then be more prepared to take on a game at Auburn, at LSU at night, at Alabama, at Georgia. Same with Oklahoma, right? If they had to go and play at Texas every other year, it would be extremely hostile, and it would prepare them for some of the things they're going to see in the SEC. I like Kansas. I like Kansas State. I like Iowa State. I like Texas Tech. I like West Virginia. That you're talking about 40 or 50,000 people that this is the part where people are going to say SEC homer. Look, I don't see how you're not going to deny that, are you? Do you think there's any road environment Texas or Oklahoma has ever played in the Big 12 that will compare to at LSU or at Auburn? No. And it'll catch up to you. LSU will get a win. That puts Oklahoma finishing their first season in the SEC at 7-5. A disappointing season. The fans aren't going to like it. They're going to tell me I just hate Oklahoma and I'm an idiot. I never watch a game and every stat and everything else I gave is wrong. Maybe. Maybe not. But I've got Oklahoma at 7-5. Look, they could go 10-2. If Jackson Arnold hits and is a home run and the offensive line plays up to par and the defense is, but that's a lot of ifs. Against a schedule that includes Tennessee and Bama at home, LSU and Auburn on the road, Ole Miss on the road, Missouri. How many top 20 teams are you playing on the road? LSU, Missouri, Ole Miss. You play 3 top 15 teams on the road. You play 2 top 10 teams at home, Tennessee and Bama. You play a 3rd top 10 team on a neutral site. 6, 7, 8 of your games are against top 20 teams. Oklahoma's not good enough to win enough of those top 20 games to make the playoffs. Not this year, in my opinion. Appreciate you watching. Be sure and let me know down below what an idiot I am. Have a good morning.